Do you, yes, you, like the classic Disney Pixar masterpiece known only as The Incredibles? Well, you fopdoodle, sorry to inform you, but it has a plot hole in it. That's it. Game over. Time to get rid of all your Incredibles merch. Goodbye, Speed Boy action figure. Goodbye, jigsaw puzzle of the moment Bob gets told his children have been killed in a ground to air missile strike. But what is this plot hole? Well, you voluntarily clicked on this video, so I'm sure you at least care a little bit. About a third of the way through the film, fashion designer Edna tasks herself with making a new supersuit for the film's protagonist, Mr. Incredible. Then one thing leads to another and she ends up making supersuits for his whole family. But, considering the fact she hasn't spoken to Mr. or Mrs. Incredible for years and years and years, she has no reason to know the pair have kids, let alone what those kids' superpowers and measurements are.
Your daughter's suit was tricky, but I finally created a sturdy material that will disappear completely as she does.
It doesn't seem to make sense that she would have the information she needs to do this, but the film sorta needs these characters to have supersuits, so a plot hole is born. The Incredibles has, dare I say it, a few issues like this, but if someone came up to me in the street and said, The Incredibles is a terrible movie because it has these 3 plot holes, I would have them imprisoned and killed. At the end of the day, the film is still a tremendous achievement with its phenomenal character work and visual storytelling and mostly sound plot. Even the scene that contains the plot hole I was just talking about is mostly great, funny dialogue accompanied by visuals that naturally and humorously communicate the emotions of the characters.
The fabric is comfortable for sensitive skin. It can also withstand a temperature of over 1,000 degrees.
I imagine for a lot of people, this is probably the kind of thing that comes to mind when they think of plot holes. Something small that generally you really only notice after you stop to think about it. You know, the kind of thing that CinemaSins would point out if they hadn't realized it was way easier to just make stuff up.
In a world where superpowers are real, physical injuries as a result of superpowers are not real.
Here's the next shot of the movie that CinemaSins decided not to include in their video. Oh, do we just like to do a little bit of lying on purpose? Is that what we do? Do we like to do a little bit of lying? I think it's this kind of perception of plot holes that's allowed people like Patrick Willems to step into the slimy tendrils of internet discourse. Wait, who's that? All the way back in 2018, YouTuber with middle school English teacher vibes Patrick Willems released a video that's been living rent-free in my head ever since.
Everywhere you turn, people are complaining about...
Just hearing that noise again has set off my fight or flight response. The reason that I'm digging this video up again after, what, 4 years is it got under my skin. It is as simple as that. It still haunts my nightmares to this day. So today, I'd like to respond to the video, not only refuting its points, but also coming to some of my own conclusions about its subject matter in the process. Because what better way is there to get to the root of your own opinions on a topic than to dissect the opinions of someone else who's getting it very, very wrong. Buckle in, because this is gonna get spicy. His video, which I feel at some point I probably should mention, is called Shut Up About Plot Holes, posits 2 main things that I'm interested in covering. The first is that in online spaces, people don't even seem to know what a plot hole even is.
No one seems to actually know what a plot hole is.
Including him. The second, which I feel is probably going to be a bit more contentious, is...
And all those plot holes people complain about, they don't actually matter.
Which, even when talking about stuff like that Incredibles plot hole, I'm not sure I totally agree with. I'll happily say that on its own at surface level, and that it really doesn't matter very much, but at the end of the day, it is still part of the construction of the film's plot. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Okay guys, we gotta talk about that.
Patrick begins the meat of his video with something very useful that I support wholeheartedly: defining his terms.
What is a plot hole? People's definitions vary, but here's the generally accepted one that I use. A plot hole is a point in which a story breaks a previously established rule about its own universe. Basically, it's when a story contradicts itself.
That's pretty good, and I think we're on the same page here. A plot hole is a contradiction within a story. It has to be something that actually affects the story, otherwise you'd start calling continuity errors plot holes, and they're not. The fact that a hat appears in Captain Picard's hand in between shots isn't a plot hole. It doesn't affect the plot. It's just a hat. Damn, look at his arms, dude. But we're off to a pretty good start.
Okay. So here's what are not plot holes.
It's at this point in the video, though, that Patrick decides to take a look at a few commonly cited plot holes and dunk on the people complaining about them for just how wrong they are.
Movies tend to assume that the audience is reasonably intelligent. But I guess they're wrong.
Don't worry, you will be seeing this clip again. And each one that he brings up is supposed to represent a different type of common mistake that people make when citing them. The first quote-unquote plot hole he destroys with facts and logic is that one from The Dark Knight is one of the millions from The Dark Knight Rises. He brings it up to make the point that something happening off screen isn't a plot hole, it's just something happening off screen, and that's fine.
In The Dark Knight Rises, we never see how Batman gets back to Gotham City. That's a plot hole.
One of the earliest cinematic developments was the concept of montage. The idea is that when two images are presented in sequence, the audience understands that they occur chronologically and will mentally fill in the time between scenes. So for instance, if a person is in one location and the next scene they're in another location, we understand that in between scenes they traveled between the locations. Movies tend to assume that the audience is reasonably intelligent, but I guess they're wrong. If movies showed us every single second that happened during the span of the story, they would be 40 hours long and really f***ing boring.
In The Dark Knight Rises, Batman suffers a heavy loss to the film's main antagonist, Bane, who decides to imprison Batman in a big hole. Batman, though, being Batman, eventually manages to escape the big hole and makes his way back to Gotham to destroy a random building with a military helicopter. Batman's journey from the hole to Gotham City happens off-screen, but thanks to Patrick's very helpful explanation of the concept of montage, we now all know that it's fine for things to happen off-screen, unlike before, when that was something we didn't know. Although now I come to think of it, the process of Batman going back to Gotham isn't gonna be as simple as him just going there. To get back to Gotham, he needs to travel overseas, but he doesn't have some kind of private jet waiting for him. In fact, due to previous events in the film's story, he is broke and penniless. He has absolutely nothing on his person, every contact of his that we know of is in no position to help him, and also he recently broke his back, although don't worry about that, that's this whole other thing. Don't worry though, it gets worse. At this point in the story, Gotham City is being ruled over by Bane, who has blockaded it. The only way in or out of the city is a single heavily guarded bridge. Even going through the water is going to be a little bit more complicated than just swimming. We never find out how Batman deals with any of these problems. We just cut to him back in the city and none of it's ever mentioned. Now, it's not totally inconceivable for Batman to have found some way of overcoming these obstacles, but it is a little more complex than—
If a person is in one location and the next scene they're in another location, we understand that in between scenes they traveled between the locations. Movies tend to assume that the audience is reasonably intelligent, but I guess they're wrong.
This really recontextualizes the fact that the only way of patching up this supposed plot hole that Patrick can conceive of is showing every second of Batman's journey, when in reality people who subscribe to this criticism are only asking for a few very specific bits of information. Listen to how this plot hole is first presented in the video.
In The Dark Knight Rises, we never see how Batman gets back to Gotham City.
We never see how Batman gets back to Gotham City? Isn't it a massive plot hole how we never see this thing? Although obviously, to actually engage with the argument being made in good faith, the emphasis should be on the word how. The whole discussion is about how he got there. To which Patrick's rocked up, put on a pair of sunglasses, called everyone in the room a moron, and told them that what they don't understand is that he went there. Patrick doubles down on the idea that people who subscribe to this criticism literally don't understand that things can happen between shots later in the video as well.
Look, if you want to watch stuff this way, you can even find plot holes in this video. I'm indoors in one shot and outdoors in the next, but we never see me go outside. Plot hole.
Yes, Patrick, that's exactly the same thing as traveling halfway across the world and infiltrating what is effectively a fortress with seemingly no resources whatsoever. Well done. I do find there's an interesting question raised by this, though. It's not something Patrick addresses, but I would like to talk about it. We, the audience, don't know how Batman managed to get back to Gotham, but that doesn't mean it's impossible for him to have got there. He could, for example, have had some previously unseen contact who owed him a favor and agreed to pick him up and airdrop him back into Gotham. That's possible. Similarly, with that Incredibles plot hole I mentioned earlier, it's entirely possible that Mr. Incredible went and visited Edna again off-screen and gave her all of the information she would need to make super suits for his kids. And considering the fact that later on in the film she clearly does have that information, surely it's reasonable to assume that something like that happened. And hey, while we're at it, why do we assume that that hat appearing in Captain Picard's hand is a continuity error? Maybe he just picked it up in between shots. After all, one of the earliest cinematic developments was the concept of montage. You can explain away literally anything you want if you're willing to write enough fanfiction in your head to justify it. The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities that some consider to be unnatural after all. Somehow Batman returned. I do think though that it's at least a reasonable perspective to say that any information that's critical to understanding how the story happens should probably be included in the story, at least in an ideal world. If that kind of information is missing from a story, I think it might even be reasonable to describe that as some kind of hole in the plot. Still though, what it is and isn't reasonable for an audience to just assume can be a difficult balance to strike. You don't want to over-explain everything, but you probably also don't want your audience to have to write entire scenes and inject them halfway through your story just to make sense of the events that are taking place. I personally believe that's a pretty good rule of thumb, although it's never going to account for every possible eventuality. There are always going to be exceptions. There's never going to be one single correct answer for what it is and isn't reasonable to assume happens off screen. The next type of supposedly commonly miscited plot hole Patrick brings up is when a character does something you wouldn't do.
There are so many plot holes in A Quiet Place. Oh, it's such a great movie. I mean, like, why did they decide to have a baby? And why didn't they just move to the waterfall?
For those unfamiliar, A Quiet Place, which I am gonna spoil by the way, is a movie set in a post-apocalypse dominated by monsters. These monsters track their prey almost entirely via sound, so if you remain silent, they can't find you. The film aims to be a tense, atmospheric horror that follows people as they try their best to survive in this scenario. As all this is going on, the mother of the family we follow is Pregnant, and in a scenario where if you make a loud noise, you'll probably die, something that has no understanding of the world around it whatsoever and is known for just screaming constantly, like, for example, is probably something you should avoid birthing. However, that all depends on what your priorities are. Different people are driven by all different kinds of things, and having a child is something that a lot of people probably are willing to risk dying for. Raising a baby in this world is gonna be a difficult but not necessarily impossible task, and they have prepared for it. It's an extraordinarily reckless decision, but it's still one that these very family-oriented characters may make if they believe they're up to the challenge. Also, you know, it could have been a mistake.
This is the one that really drives me nuts. Movies are, for the most part, about human beings, or at least characters who think and act like human beings. And you know what human beings are not? Logical. People are impulsive. They make choices based on emotion. Not everyone thinks exactly the same. And also, people make mistakes.
This argument is a reasonable response to people citing the pregnancy plot hole, so long as you cut it exactly there and don't let it play any further. If I were to nitpick it, I would say that it's not really right to say that humans are strictly not logical. Most thoughts that most people have will have some kind of internal logic to them, even if that logic is flawed in some way. But let's just do him the favor of assuming that what he meant to say was that humans aren't exclusively logical, and yeah, that's fine.
Acting logically is at odds with acting human.
No, Patrick, stop it! If I recall correctly though, the pregnancy was only one of two supposed plot holes brought up, so what was that second one again?
Why did they decide to have a baby? And why didn't they just move to the waterfall?
Right, bear with me for a moment. Let's paint an even clearer picture of how the people in A Quiet Place live their lives. To avoid dying, they don't talk out loud at all. Even in their own home, every conversation is had via sign language. They play Monopoly, but have replaced all of the little plastic and metal game pieces with things made of cloth, or wool, or felt, presumably because they make less sound when they come into contact with other objects. They don't even use plates, instead they use leaves on wooden boards. And when one of them makes the mistake of accidentally knocking over a single lamp, this causes a very genuine and real risk that they might all suddenly die. About halfway through the movie though, we're introduced to the concept that if there's enough ambient noise in your location, that will mask any noise that you make. And the river where the family does their fishing, to get their fish, has a waterfall in it so loud that they can make as much noise as they want nearby. This is a place they can actually talk to each other verbally if that's something they want to do. Considering this is a place they can pass gas loudly in their sleep without risking a death creature hearing the fart and rapidly sprinting directly towards it, a lot of people have said that it's a plot hole that they didn't move here. I mean, if they did live here, that would alleviate what is now the main danger of living in the world, and the quartering could play freely. More specific suggestions include setting up tents right by the waterfall, or traveling up the river to find an abandoned riverside property to live in because we are shown that even when you're not right by the waterfall, the river does create some ambient noise that still masks other noises. But whatever version of it you're talking about, it often was cited as a plot hole that the family didn't do this.
Move the family next to the fucking waterfall? At the very least, deliver the baby there. You can scream and yell next to this waterfall, but you pick a house in the middle of a quiet field with nothing around.
That doesn't make any sense. If there's a waterfall where you can even scream and get away with it, why doesn't the family just live near the waterfall or even the river? So in this movie, a quiet place means death. So the family decides to live in the most quiet place possible in the middle of nowhere.
The bigger question here is, why don't they just live near the river? The home you have doesn't seem to be fortified enough to prevent them from getting in anyway. Even just having a fucking tent out there seems like a better idea than living in your home where if you drop something, they come kill you.
They currently live in a situation where knocking over a lamp could kill them, and this move would alleviate that completely. To people making this argument, moving to the waterfall is an obvious solution to the majority of problems the characters are facing in the film. Whether you agree with them or not, what they're saying is that the solution is right there and extremely obvious. When someone asks why they haven't taken that solution, you can't just go and say,
People are impulsive. They make choices based on emotion. Not everyone thinks exactly the same. And also, people make mistakes.
yeah, I make mistakes, but I've never deliberately removed both my legs with a hacksaw before thinking, wait, was that a bad idea? The point here is that very few people actually think that a character doing something they personally wouldn't do is a plot hole. I think it's pretty obvious that the overwhelming majority of people who make complaints like these ones, even if they're wrong, believe that these are decisions the characters wouldn't make. That is, if they're actually citing it as a plot hole rather than just a character decision they didn't like for some other reason.
Your story's not scary because the characters are making choices the audience wouldn't make.
But maybe Patrick does understand this. His argument isn't over after all. Let's allow him to keep talking, and see what else he says.
You know how in Star Trek, Vulcans live dominated by logic, and it's established that acting logically is at odds with acting human. So if everyone acted totally logically all the time, only making the most logical decision in any situation, no one would be acting human. Thus, there would be no conflict, which would lead to no drama, which would lead to no stories. And movies would be really f***ing boring.
I'm really glad Patrick mentioned Star Trek here. I'm just gonna pretend it wasn't specifically the J.J. Abrams films, and you're not going to mind, okay? The Next Generation specifically is one of my favorite shows of all time. My personal favorite character is Commander Data, an android whose primary drive in any situation is to logically assess it.
You are capable of great sadism and cruelty. Interesting. No redeeming qualities.
And yet many of his focal episodes are fan favorites, delivering hard-hitting emotional payoffs.
That action injured you and saved me. I will not forget it.
Imagine a version of the air horn that signifies complex emotional growth, please. Here's the thing though, I've kind of tricked you by talking about Commander Data first here, because you know who else in Star Trek The Next Generation acts extremely logically? Fucking everyone. Okay, so Worf can be overly aggressive, and Riker is quite emotionally driven, but none of these characters are going to make a random illogical decision just to further the plot, at least not in a good episode.
I will not stand by while half my crew is slaughtered.
I do not believe there is anything you can do to prevent it.
Yes, there is. Destroy the Enterprise.
That's not better. Not only that, in this show, all these characters are only in the position of being senior officers on the Enterprise because of how capable and qualified they are. They all have different ideas, personalities, and skill sets, but all for the most part act according to their own internal logic. They don't all act the same as one another though, because when you have different skills and different beliefs, acting logically can mean different things for different individuals. Despite being the most coldly logical character in the show, Commander Data makes plenty of mistakes because he doesn't understand everything. When making his logical assessments, he can't consider things that he doesn't understand or know. Take this scene for example, where he struggles to navigate a conversation successfully, not because he acts illogically in any way, but because he doesn't understand the body language, emotions, and motivations of the person he's talking to.
This is Lieutenant Commander Data of the Federation Starship Enterprise.
Korra.
I take it that is your name. May I inquire as to your destination?
No.
May I ask the purpose of your journey?
No.
Perhaps I have not made our intentions clear. We're investigating.
Basically, any other main character in the show would probably have handled that dialogue better and would have been more likely to get something fruitful out of it. Making a normal human mistake doesn't require someone to abandon logic. Let's have a look at another Star Trek episode. In the episode The Inner Light, the Enterprise encounters a mysterious probe that zaps Captain Picard with a beam of some kind. Next thing he knows, he's waking up in a location completely unfamiliar to him, but everyone around him is insisting they know him, his name is Kamen, and he doesn't remember them because he's been ill, and that his illness has affected his memory. Captain Picard has always been a smart pickle, and acts entirely logically throughout this story. That doesn't mean he's devoid of emotion, it just means he's rational and acts in accordance with his motivations and understanding of the world. None of the characters ever act illogically to further the plot. Therefore there's no conflict, therefore there's no drama, therefore there's no story, and therefore the episode definitely hasn't gone on to generally be revered as one of, if not the greatest Star Trek episode of all time.
So if everyone acted totally logically all the time, only making the most logical decision in any situation, no one would be acting human.
Of course, I doubt that Patrick would actually believe that Captain Picard doesn't act like a human being in The Inner Light. Instead, I think he just has an extremely simplistic view of what it means to act logically, conflating the idea of acting in a logical manner with being totally emotionless, like a Vulcan from Star Trek. In The Inner Light, there's a scene where Captain Picard's supposed son tells him that he'd like to pursue music instead of going to school.
I'm leaving school. I want to concentrate on my music.
I think Patrick would probably categorize this as an illogical decision, but it's not illogical. It's just motivated by the fulfillment of an emotional need rather than the fulfillment of a material one. This character's motivation is to live a life that he finds fulfilling, and he's currently taking the actions that he thinks are most likely to help him achieve that goal. That is a logical decision. Similarly, if the characters in A Quiet Place considered what they understood to be the risks involved with having another child, and came to the conclusion that for them it was worth that risk, that would not necessarily be an illogical decision. Even when a character does make a decision that seems illogical and goes against their established motivations, the aspect of that character's personality that drove them to make that decision is still something that it's important to communicate to the audience. This is why the vast majority of people defending A Quiet Place from these criticisms argue that these decisions would make sense for the characters making them, rather than just vaguely gesturing to the concept that people have emotions and make mistakes. And while you can accidentally get pregnant, you can't accidentally not move to the waterfall for a year. In fact, none of Patrick's suggestions as to why a character may make an illogical decision seem to apply to their decision not to move to the waterfall. They didn't impulsively stay living in a farmhouse for over a year. The film doesn't present us with an emotional reason that they're staying there either. Patrick spends his entire time defending it, arguing that people make illogical decisions, so does seem to agree that it is an illogical decision, but doesn't present us with any valid reason the characters actually made it. Instead, just hiding behind the shield of people are not logical. They're just not, okay? Shut up, stop being mean. Characters need reasons to behave in the way that they do.
If everyone acted totally logically all the time, only making the most logical decision in any situation, no one would be acting human.
Is entirely true. Just as it's also true that if characters are making random illogical decisions just to further the plot, they're not acting human either. I forgot the next bit. They're not acting human either. And the fact that humans aren't purely logical creatures isn't something you can just whip out to justify any character decision you like. Alright, let's move on to the next type of not plot hole that Patrick brings up, which is a plot contrivance.
There is a huge plot hole in Star Wars. I mean, come on. Why would the Death Star have such an obvious design flaw?
Okay, some of these can be valid complaints.
Hold up, sound the alarm. Patrick, what have you done? With that short sentence, Patrick has absolutely demolished everything. Let me explain why. A core part of this video's premise is that a plot hole is not a legitimate grievance to have with a film. Patrick will later go on to state this explicitly.
You can find plot holes or logic gaps in any movie. Just don't tell me that those are genuine flaws and problems and reasons that a movie is bad, because they're not. None of these things actually matter.
Patrick's stance is clear. Plot holes and logic gaps don't matter and are not legitimate grievances, but plot contrivances can be.
Sometimes there's a story development that's a little too convenient. In the 2009 Star Trek, Kirk just happens to get stranded on the same planet as old Spock, and they end up in the same cave together so Spock can explain what's going on. I like the movie, but that's a little contrived and lazy. but it's not a plot hole.
And of course, if it was a plot hole, then it would no longer be a legitimate grievance. So, based only on the positions that he has outlined, if you were to say rewrite Star Trek so that Kirk bumping into Spock wasn't just unlikely, it was blatantly impossible, then it would no longer be a legitimate grievance because then it would be a plot hole. Although he seems to briefly attempt to, Patrick doesn't really expand on why he considers this a legitimate form of grievance in any meaningful way. All he does is describe the plot contrivance as lazy, but obviously a plot hole can also be a clear symptom of laziness. Like, the reason that a plot contrivance would be lazy is that it's a writer making the thing they want to happen just happen without earning it. Do you know how many plot holes that phrase describes?
Like, hey, how did Indiana Jones survive clinging to the outside of that submarine?
So, that's interesting. Definitely putting a pin in this one for later.
I mean, how does Benicio del Toro know the rebels' plans? Nobody told him. That's a plot hole.
Oh, at least 50% of the plot holes that I see people complain about are things that are actually explained in the movie if you just pay attention. Like that one in The Last Jedi, there's a scene where you see—
Look, stop, you're not gonna get me to go and watch The Last Jedi again. This one is Patrick presenting the bold new idea that sometimes people are wrong about things. A point that he's already expertly demonstrated. This isn't some issue unique to plot hole discussion, so really doesn't belong here in this video. All avenues of film discussion and life are filled with people who are wrong for various reasons. Even I was wrong once. We've now reached the end of Patrick's list of commonly miscited types of plot hole, and, well, I don't think he's done quite as much epic dunking as he seems to think he has.
But I guess if you're too busy live tweeting about plot holes, you can miss some stuff.
Before we move on to the next part of Patrick's video, I want to bring up another plot hole. Or, well, really a few plot holes, but they all sort of come packaged together. With that Incredibles plot hole I brought up, really, I was doing Patrick a favor. He wants to convince you that plot holes don't matter, and that they're really not the kind of thing that someone who's actually engaged with the story they're watching will be thinking about. And this plot hole has a minimal impact on the story, and isn't even the kind of thing that most viewers have even noticed. It's a small, relatively inconsequential nitpick, and that's how Patrick wants you to perceive all plot holes. But are all plot holes really like that? Another Life.
Pigeon sounds.
Is a Netflix original I've talked about on this channel before. The show follows a spaceship and its crew on their way to make first contact with an alien civilization. The mission is extremely important, but they run into danger along the way. In episode 6, for example, the ship experiences a cascade of critical failures in various systems. The crew has to deal with and fix these problems as they pop up. First, the artificial gravity fails. Then the ship's AI glitches out and wrongfully initiates an emergency protocol that nearly kills the whole crew. Finally, the ship's particle accelerator starts overloading, threatening to destroy the entire ship if it's not shut down. On top of all that, throughout this whole thing, random bits of the ship have just been exploding. At one point, a fire extinguisher is even blown off a wall, landing on and destroying the only emergency shutdown switch for the particle accelerator. Wow, inconvenient, am I right? The crew is lucky to survive, only solving these massive issues just in the nick of time. But what caused all of these seemingly unrelated massive problems? Well, I'm glad you asked. It was a bug chewing through a wire.
What is that? One of those bugs from that moon?
Goddamn little stowaway must have chewed its way into the diagnostic unit. Shorted a wire.
This apparently caused the diagnostic unit to catch fire for about 15 seconds, which in turn caused all of the major problems. And the explanation we're given as to why that happened is—
Shit for brain assholes who designed this tin pile of fuck better pray they never meet me in a dark alley.
Everything's connected, Michelle.
Everything's connected. Yeah, sure, that makes sense, why not? A bug chews through a wire in a diagnostic unit? Time for critical systems on the other side of the ship to start randomly blowing up.
Are you saying this is all because of that fire in the docking bay?
The surge must have busted a regulator.
Oh, okay, random technical words, now it makes sense. Anyway, that's the context for the plot hole I want to tell you about. In the same episode, we learn that an alien imposter has taken over the supposed brain of one of the crew members. After the initial bug chewing through a wire crisis has been averted, the imposter then spends the next 2 episodes trying to sabotage the ship with the end goal of destroying it completely.
Is there any way to stop it?
Well, the ships are weapons, so you'd have to destroy the Salvari, which is easier said than done.
Despite the previous episode having clearly established that you could very easily take out the entire ship by shorting a single wire.
Are you telling me that William got taken out by a space bus?
This code is insanely complicated, okay? More complicated than a human brain.
Maybe more complicated than yours? Despite the fact that the imposter has absorbed all the information from the brains of multiple members of the crew, including one of the main engineers who was working on solving all of these problems.
He was searching my brain for weaknesses in our defenses, anything he could use.
These episodes then proceed to pretend that dealing any kind of significant damage to the ship is actually really, really hard.
I don't know what else I can do. I've tried everything I can think of, everything in Javier's head.
Hey, here's an idea. Why don't you start just messing with random wires? Because last time something did that, the entire ship nearly blew up. Instead, he concocts an extremely elaborate scheme which involves, but is not limited to, him trying to get the ship's computer to flirt with the ship's captain in the hopes that she will then reject him, in the hopes that this will make the ship's computer so sad that he stops working. This is real! This is the plot of the fucking show! Not all plot holes are subtle little inconsequential details that you have to stop and think to notice. They can be that, and they often are, but as with all different kinds of flaws that can be found within writing, they come in all different levels of severity. Sometimes they can have you yelling at your screen for 40 minutes because a character is now conveniently ignoring the solution to their problems that was established just one episode ago. A plot hole can be subtle or conspicuous, tiny or ridiculous, one can be forgotten within seconds or can stick with us. When they are conspicuous and ridiculous, one of the most obvious effects this might have on an audience is breaking their immersion. A story's plot being moved forward in a way that doesn't make sense can be confusing, or frustrating, or laughable, and all of these emotions can override the intended emotion that the scene you're watching is trying to convey. Oh no, these godlike beings are going to go and terrorize the Earth, and the doctor can't do anything about it because she's been imprisoned by them. I wonder how she'll deal with this situation. What? Patrick, though, is about to go on to argue that plot holes do exist, but are never actually problems in any way at all. And he begins this argument by attempting to point out that all movies, including widely praised movies, have plot holes in them. To try and prove this, he lists a load of plot holes from popular movies, some of which appear to be completely legitimate examples of real plot holes. Awkwardly, though, some of them are...
In Lord of the Rings, the Eagles could have just flown the ring to Mount Doom and saved everyone all that trouble.
In my opinion, the most egregious example he brings up is this one from Alien.
In Alien, if the acid can melt through the floor, why doesn't it melt through the entire ship?
Damn, Patrick, good question. So good, in fact, that it's literally the first concern voiced by the characters in the film as soon as this happens.
That crap's gonna eat through the hull.
That crap's gonna eat through the hull. That's literally the clip you're playing, muted, as you tell your audience this is something the filmmakers overlooked. Because the characters act in a logical way and don't want a hull breach, they pursue the acid through the different decks of the ship.
That thing's gonna eat through the goddamn hull, come on!
And they determine that after eating through a few floors, it's lost its potency and stopped naturally.
Looks like it's stopping.
There's an entire scene dedicated to this. How busy were you live tweeting about plot holes? But are these even supposed to be examples of real plot holes? Well, that's a question I've been thinking about for 4 years because I'm so healthy. One thing that suggests to me they're not is how Patrick ends his list of plot holes.
In Star Wars, why does the Death Star have a trash compactor when they can just jettison the trash into space? Look, if you want to watch stuff this way, you can even find plot holes in this video. Why am I wearing sunglasses if I'm inside?
I can answer that.
I'm indoors in one shot and outdoors in the next, but we never see me go outside. Plot hole. You can find plot holes or logic gaps in any movie.
Okay, so his conclusion there that he then uses to segue into his next point is that you can find plot holes or logic gaps in any movie. But those last two that he brought up at his desk are clearly examples of two types of commonly miscited plot hole he brought up earlier. The sunglasses one is when a character does something you wouldn't do, and the never see me go outside one is something happening off screen. But the point that he's using this to make is that if so many beloved movies have plot holes in them, then surely plot holes can't be that bad. To make this point effectively, you would need to use examples of real plot holes. Otherwise, you've just persuaded people that the movies are good because they don't actually have plot holes in them. Plus, if this whole thing is supposed to be a list of miscited plot holes, why are there totally legitimate examples of real plot holes in there? Well, whether these are supposed to be legitimate plot holes or not, even though those first ones definitely are presented as if they are, but never mind, this is still a bad argument. And it's a fairly common one, so I think it's one that it's important to cover. Fortunately, I've already set up my counter-argument. The Incredibles is a great film despite its few small plot holes. Don't worry though, if those actually did turn you off it, I wouldn't really have you imprisoned and killed. That was a joke. I'm not Matt Walsh. Another Life, on the other hand, is garbage, and its plot holes are a big part of that. Its story is so conspicuously nonsense that it's impossible to take any part of it seriously. It's almost as if plot holes can exist with varying levels of severity. They can be tiny, ridiculous, or anywhere in between. If you tried to make this same argument about any other aspect of filmmaking, people would laugh in your face. Hey, did you know that lighting doesn't actually matter at all? There are loads of really popular movies that have a couple of shots in them that are lit suboptimally, yet those movies are still great? Curious. This argument only gets perpetuated about plot holes because of this bizarre perception that plot holes are always small and insubstantial.
You can find plot holes or logic gaps in any movie, and if you want to, go right ahead. Just don't tell me that those are genuine flaws and problems and reasons that a movie is bad. Because they're not. None of these things actually matter. Because they're not what a movie is about.
Movies aren't about lighting, Patrick, but you still want to light your shots properly. Video essays aren't about lighting either, but I can still tell you put effort into it because I can see the reflection of your studio lights in your sunglasses that you're wearing. Also, forgive me if I don't believe you when you say,
and if you want to, go right ahead.
Look, all I'm saying is that I would be more inclined to believe you when you say that you're fine with people pointing out plot holes so long as they're not telling you that those are actually problems with the films. If the description of this video was literally anything other than plot holes don't matter, stop talking about them. We're now fully into the plot holes don't matter section of Patrick's video. Here he overdramatically waffles on about how plot holes never matter because movies aren't about logic.
Even though most people are using the term plot hole incorrectly, all of these complaints are rooted in the same thing. But movies aren't about logic. They're not equations, they're not proofs, they're not puzzles. Movies are not math.
Thank you, I thought that movies were math. I really don't understand why anyone thinks this argument is persuasive. Why try to denigrate an aspect of writing and filmmaking by pointing out that it's not generally considered to be the focus of the art form? Logic may not be something every audience member is consciously thinking about, but it still informs how they understand the work. Logic is the most fundamental and basic building block on top of which a story is built. Another Life still has plenty of logic in it. You know how the alien imposter wants to destroy the ship, so tries to destroy the ship? That's logic, baby! A character being dead because they died is logic. This is a piece of logic that Another Life manages to get right, although Star Wars doesn't. A character walking to a place to get to that place is logic. In this sense, Another Life is a mostly logical story, but there are just very obvious lapses within that logic. I wouldn't expect anyone to call Another Life a logical story because the gaps within that logic are so obvious, but the point here is that logic isn't just something that applies to nerdy little plot details. It applies from the ground up through every aspect of a story's construction. A story is a progression of events from A to B to C and so on. For it to be even comprehensible, there needs to be at least a basic level of logic. The more logic you have, the more coherent your story becomes. Now, The Incredibles proves to us that you don't have to be totally logical in literally every aspect of your story to impress the majority of audiences, as does any other great and popular film that has a couple of plot holes in it. But for everyone, there will always be a breaking point, a point where a lack of logic obscures or distracts from the intended purpose of a work and what it's trying to communicate. This could absolutely ruin a film for someone, or it could just make a single scene a little bit less enjoyable for them than it would have been otherwise. Lapses in the logic by which a plot develops are a problem in the same way that any other potential flaw in a film is a problem. One clunky line of dialogue delivered awkwardly, a single poorly lit or poorly framed shot, one subpar visual effect, or a plot hole. All of these things are minor issues. But not only are they minor issues, they're all minor versions of problems that can exist in major ways. Patrick's argument also blatantly overlooks something that I think it is quite important to at least acknowledge when you're making a point like this. Some movies actually are about logic though. The crime and mystery genre, for example, typically produces films that encourage the audience to actively consider and think about the plot. Being shown parts of a plot and then slowly finding out how they all fit together in a logical way is a core part of the appeal of these stories for a lot of people. One of my favorite shows of all time, The Haunting of Bly Manor, has an enormous mystery element to it. And while I also deeply care about its characters and themes, its plot and how neatly it fits together is a large part of why it works so well. This type of appeal isn't something that's unique to the crime and mystery genre. It can exist in all different types of movies, whether it's the focus or just another part of the overall experience. In order to argue in favor of his perspective, Patrick is about to bring up 4 films and make a case for why the plot holes in those films don't constitute valid forms of criticism. And he starts with Die Hard. I like Die Hard.
On the site movieplotholes.com, there are 7 plot holes listed for Die Hard. The first one says that the villain's plan is to stage a hostage situation so that the police will shut down power to the building, allowing them to access the vault. But since they would have already had detailed plans of the building, they could have just shut down power themselves, making the whole thing more simple. Now, I know it seems impossible to watch movies wrong, but you're watching movies wrong.
I went to the site movieplotholes.com and was shocked and disgusted to find it was just a list of plot holes.
Die Hard is a movie about an ordinary man thrown into an impossible situation, who needs to rise to the occasion and persevere so that he can reunite with his estranged wife. That's the point of the movie. That's what it's about. Most of the other plot holes for Die Hard listed on the site are variations on, why didn't John McClane do this? Well, because the whole point of John McClane is that he's a normal guy who makes human mistakes. If he did the perfect, most logical thing every single time, he wouldn't be the same character. He'd basically be a Vulcan, and the movie would end way earlier and be terrible.
A lot of what Patrick said while talking about Die Hard was oversimplified. Die Hard isn't just about John McClane rising to the situation and reuniting with his wife. I mean, yes, he is the protagonist character, and reconnecting with Holly is a significant part of his journey. Die Hard, though, quite honestly, is a rich tapestry of character work, and the film's point, so to speak, is by no means limited to those two. Personally, I find John McClane's relationship with Holly to be pretty low on the list of character relationships in that film that I care about. Patrick, if you got out of the cinema having just watched Die Hard with a friend and said all of this to them, and then they turned to you and said, well, actually, personally, I was much more invested in Hans Gruber's journey, what would you say to them? Wrong. Of course, that's important because Hans Gruber's journey is the one that's actually directly affected by this plot hole. He is a genuinely great villain, hot take, I know. It's really engaging seeing him enact his meticulous plans and seeing how he deals with a spanner in the works. If we just accept that this is a plot hole without questioning it, then while not film ruining, it genuinely could be a little bit frustrating to watch this character who you know is a smart and meticulous planner not take an obvious course of action that would help him achieve his goals. So I went to movieplotholes.com and I've got to say I'm not particularly impressed with the supposed plot holes they identified. A few of the plot holes listed are things like, why didn't John McClane do this? And the genuine answer is, that's not the kind of character he is. For example, they ask why John actively taunted the villains after he first kills one of them, arguing that if he hadn't done that, they wouldn't even know he was in the building, and he'd be able to use that fact to his advantage. It's true that letting the villains know he was there probably wasn't the best tactical decision he could have made. However, John is consistently characterized as the kind of person who would make that decision anyway. Not only is he a character who's shown to actively enjoy taunting his enemies,
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
He's also consistently willing to give up a potential advantage in order to do it. Take this moment where he risks warning an opponent that he's about to attack them just so he can quip.
You won't hurt me.
Yeah? Why not?
Because you're a policeman. There are rules for policemen.
Yeah. That's what my captain keeps telling me.
The most tactically sound decision here would have been to allow his opponent to think he's not going to attack him in order to take him by surprise. But John McClane thought of a quip and couldn't resist saying it. Throughout the film, he makes decisions that'll be immediately emotionally gratifying to him, rather than ones that'll have the best lasting consequences. That's just the kind of man that he is. One of the first decisions we see him make is picking a fight with his wife because something was bugging him and he wanted to get it off his chest.
I missed you.
I guess you didn't miss my name, though, huh? Except maybe when you're signing checks. Since when did you start using Ms. Gennaro?
And then immediately after, he regrets it. Because he wasn't thinking about the long-term ramifications, he was thinking about what he wanted in that moment. The man even stops paying attention to his surroundings for a sec in an active hostage situation to check out a nudie calendar, for God's sake. One of my favorite moments like this is one that perfectly demonstrates one of the differences between himself and his antagonist Hans Gruber. Over the course of the film so far, John has been doing plenty of hiding and listening in and eavesdropping and has learnt a fair amount about his antagonists. Hans, on the other hand, knows basically nothing about John other than having ruled out the idea of him being a security guard.
A security guard we missed? Usually tired old policemen growing fat on a pension. No, this is something else.
So when it comes time for the two to have their first conversation, it's really interesting to watch what they reveal about what they know. Hans chooses to pretend he thinks John is a security guard to see if he can learn anything from the way in which John responds.
You are most troublesome for a security guard.
Sorry, Hans, wrong guess.
He's pretending that he's dumber than he actually is because he thinks that in this situation he might be able to use that to get an advantage. John, on the other hand...
I thought I told all of you I want radio silence until further...
I'm very sorry, Hans. I didn't get that message. I figured since I waxed Tony and Marco and his friend here, I figured you and Carl and Franco might be a little lonely, so I wanted to give you a call.
How does he know so much about this?
John doesn't play his cards close to his chest at all, immediately revealing that he knows plenty about these guys on purpose as a boast. He brags about the three of them that he killed and reveals that he knows plenty of their names, as if to say, I am in your walls. It could definitely be argued that he's trying to make them uneasy and anxious so that they make more mistakes, but he also clearly definitely enjoys taunting them. He is absolutely the kind of character who would deliberately reveal his presence in order to taunt the villain. And you see, this is how you argue against someone incorrectly citing a character decision as a plot hole. Right, now even though Patrick was just fully handed this blatantly miscited plot hole that neatly fits into one of his miscited plot hole categories, his argument against it still takes things way too far to a ridiculous extent, and seems to miss why John McClane makes these decisions in the first place.
Well, because the whole point of John McClane is that he's a normal guy who makes human mistakes.
Deliberately going out of your way to actively taunt a group of machine gun wielding terrorists isn't a normal human mistake to make, Patrick! This is more confirmation that he's painting basically any illogical character decision with the same people make mistakes brush. When you make the response this generic, it could be used to justify any illogical character decision, when the only ones that should be justified are the ones that are within character. Putting aside one or two things he said there to get back to later, it's time we move on to his next example, which is...
Take Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. At the climax of the story, Harry reaches the Triwizard Cup, which turns out to have been turned into a portkey that transports him to Voldemort. The villain's whole plan hinged on Harry being the one to get to the cup first and win the tournament. But really, any random object could have been turned into a portkey, and they could have sent him to Voldemort way earlier without all that hassle.
Yeah.
But that doesn't matter. We're so invested in Harry trying to figure out a way to win, and then so surprised by the reveal of the portkey and Voldemort returning, that to pick apart the logic of the villain's plan would mean totally disengaging from the story. This, like so many plot holes, are things that would just destroy any conflict or drama and end the story immediately.
Okay, so let's just start unpacking this one, hot damn. First things first, the way Patrick frames the events of this film is downright dishonest. You know how earlier I was talking about mystery stories that encourage the viewer to actively consider the plot? And how satisfying it can be to see every element of those stories neatly brought together in the conclusion. Anyway, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire is literally a whodunit. The film sees students selected to take part in a series of magical death games called the Triwizard Tournament. Students would enter to take part in these games by putting their name in something called the Goblet of Fire, which was then supposed to select from the volunteers 3 champions to take part. After selecting 3 students though, the goblet then gives an extra 4th name, Harry Potter, despite the fact that Harry didn't even put his name in there in the first place and never volunteered. Pretty much everyone comes to the conclusion that the goblet was obviously tampered with to produce this result, although they still make a 14-year-old who didn't volunteer fight a dragon anyway, because shut up.
Put an end to it. Don't let Potter compete.
If we are to truly discover the meaning of these events, perhaps we should, for the time being, let them unfold.
hey, someone's clearly hatching some kind of sinister plot we could put an end to easily, I think the best way to investigate it is to just not do anything for the whole movie. For basically the entire film, as Harry is competing in these games, the question of who did this and why looms over the audience.
The goblet of fire is an exceptionally powerful magical object. Only an exceptionally powerful confundus charm could have hoodwinked it.
You seem to have given this a fair bit of thought. Mad-Eye.
It was once my job to think as dark wizards do, Karkaroff. Perhaps you remember.
As the story progresses, more and more mystery elements are introduced, with clear, deliberate attention being given to them. Like, for example, the murder of Barty Crouch Sr., or the fact that someone's been stealing supplies from Snape to make Polyjuice Potion. By the time Harry reaches the final game of the Triwizard Tournament, not only is this still all unresolved, but new things get added as well. We find out that some mysterious individual is using magic to mind control one of the competitors, seemingly with the goal of helping Harry to win by sabotaging his opponents. When Harry wins and takes hold of the Triwizard Cup, we find out that the cup has been turned into a portkey, which means when he touches it, he's suddenly and surprisingly transported to another location. It's at this point the villain's plan actually starts to unfold, although we don't understand every aspect of it yet. Harry's been transported to Voldemort, who needs like his blood or whatever so that he can cast a spell that will like make him return and stuff. After Harry has a confrontation with the now fully resurrected Voldemort, he manages to get back to the school, where we find out that Mad-Eye Moody, one of the teachers, was actually one of Voldemort's followers in disguise the whole time, and is secretly David Tennant. Disguises are really good in the Harry Potter universe. You can like literally change your entire face with a Polyjuice Potion. It's wild. Trans rights, by the way. We get all of this information revealed to us in one final confrontation right before the end of the film, which is played off as a big reveal of plot elements.
It was you from the beginning. You put my name in the Goblet of Fire.
You won because I made it so, Potter.
So first things first, I'd like you to think back to how Patrick framed the events of this film.
We're so invested in Harry trying to figure out a way to win, and then so surprised by the reveal of the portkey and Voldemort returning, that to pick apart the logic of the villain's plan would mean totally disengaging from the story.
So Patrick describes this film as if the only way for an audience to engage with it during the final contest of the tournament is to be invested in Harry trying to win. But if you're paying attention, like even a little bit, you know that there are still loads of other unresolved plot points. I think that it's at least a little bit possible that some audience members might be thinking about, you know, like the story of the film. Winning the Triwizard Cup isn't even that high on Harry's list of priorities.
I didn't put my name in that cup. I don't want eternal glory.
And even if when watching the final event you're literally just thinking about this sequence and nothing else, there are still elements of this mystery present. At the end of the day, I'm sure there are some audience members who watch this part thinking nothing but, whoa, is Harry gonna win? But Patrick presents this as if that's the only possible way to actually engage with this story.
That to pick apart the logic of the villain's plan would mean totally disengaging from the story.
Disengaging from the story is when you think about the story. But hey, guess what? All of that is totally irrelevant. Why is Patrick pretending? Well, actually, we know why, but Patrick is pretending that this is the only point in the film that it's, like, possible to think about the villain's plan. Viewers who are actually engaging with the media are never going to think about the villain's plan because one of the scenes in the film is surprising. I think that it's much more likely an audience member is going to be thinking about the villain's plan in, say, for example, the scene where the villain's plan is explained to the audience.
Think Cedric Diggory told you to open the egg underwater if I hadn't told him first myself? You think Neville Longbottom, the witless wonder, could have provided you with Gillyweed if I hadn't given him the book that led him straight to it?
If you notice very obvious holes in a scene like this, it can break your immersion, Patrick! There's this whole scene where the villain explains the overly elaborate lengths he went to ensure that Harry won the tournament, and that he cast a spell on the trophy so that when Harry touched it, it would transport him to Voldemort. But at the very start of the film, we're shown that you can cast that same spell on, like, seemingly anything. Watching the build-up to this point, where this crazy elaborate scheme is slowly unfolding around Harry, as far as you, the viewer, knows, there could be a satisfying answer to why everything is the way it is. As far as you know, the film could be leading you towards a moment that's gonna make you go, Oh! You could be given a final piece of the puzzle that makes it clear why some mysterious figure was so interested in having Harry participate in and win this tournament. But instead, if you have the question on your mind, why did the villain do like most of the things that he did? Then the film's answer to that question is don't think about it, shut up. You as an audience member don't have to find that frustrating, but you've got to see how someone could, right? Right? And oh, guess what? I'm not done. Because even if everything Patrick just said was totally true, this argument would still only work if we were talking about a viewer's first time watching the film. I think that a great film should stand up to being rewatched. There are not many, but a few scenes in Goblet of Fire that work really, really well with the knowledge of everything that's eventually revealed. You know, in a way that makes them actively satisfying to rewatch because, for example, now you know all the answers, you're picking up on clues that you missed the first time around. Now, you may have cottoned on, I don't think this film is good, but now I want to talk about a scene that I genuinely think is really great.
But first, which of you can tell me how many unforgivable curses there are?
The school year has just begun and we're watching our characters sit down for their first lesson with their new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. This new teacher, called Mad Eye Moody, decides that he's going to demonstrate for the class the 3 unforgivable curses. The Mind Control Curse, Imperio, the Torture Curse, Crucio, and the Killing Curse, Avada Kedavra. As many teachers would, he at multiple points calls for members of the class to answer questions.
Another. Long bottom, is it? Up.
There's the Cruciatus curse.
Correct!
And watching it the first time, this scene is perfectly good. It provides decent characterization for multiple characters, it lets the audience know about and understand 3 spells that are all going to be relevant to the story later, and it does it in a way that's tonally appropriate and vaguely entertaining. Watching this film a second time though, you know that this character isn't really Mad Eye Moody, he's evil David Tennant in disguise. With that knowledge, you can pick up on intricacies within the scene that you wouldn't have noticed the first time around. In fact, certain aspects of it take on a whole new meaning. Later on in the film, we learn that back in the day, serving Voldemort, evil David Tennant tortured Neville Longbottom's parents using the Cruciatus Curse.
I know for a fact this person took part in the capture, and by means of the Cruciatus Curse, torture of the horror Frank Longbottom and his wife!
Oh hey look, it's the current Doctor. So when we get back to that classroom scene and watch evil David Tennant's behavior, what do we see? Well, when it's time for him to demonstrate the Cruciatus Curse and he asks the class if anyone can name the next spell, loads of hands go up straight away, but he doesn't call on any of those students. Instead, he waits for the son of the people he tortured with the spell he's about to demonstrate to put up his hand, and then he immediately calls on him.
Long bottom, is it?
Then insists on giving Neville a front row seat for the demonstration.
Crucio!
And then Neville is clearly deeply pained by this. The first time around, you're thinking, yeah, I guess this is a reaction someone might have to this, but the second time around, this seems way more personal. You know the history here. Evil David Tennant is being deliberately sadistic, enjoying making a student relive serious trauma. This makes the actions of both characters much deeper. The scene doesn't just still make sense with the context of everything you later learn, it's improved by it. It's good. Wouldn't it be great if, like, the whole film was like this? But no, you don't really notice that, like, huge elements of the plot don't add up because you're too busy being surprised. Great.
To an objective, omniscient viewer, it would make logical sense for Admiral Haldo to tell Poe Dameron her plan. And then there would be no conflict and no drama. Poe would never send Finn on a mission, and Finn would never grow, and Poe would never grow, and there would be no story.
Okay, it's time to actually address this point. Patrick has said things like this so much in this video, and it all culminates here. After he talks about The Last Jedi, he goes on to say this.
There's an episode of the show Community that imagined what a horror movie would look like if all the characters only made totally logical decisions.
Should we go check it out?
No. We should call 911 on my fully charged cell phone, lock the doors, and then stand back to back in the middle of the room holding knives.
And the conclusion is that it would be really boring.
As with many of his previous examples, there's a piece of information obfuscated here that I think is pretty important. This Community episode sees the cast sitting around and telling horror stories to one another. There are 7 in total, and they're all supposed to be bad. Because that's the joke.
There's one that's heavy-handed, moralizing, and preachy.
Whoa! Look, it's our friend we used to pick on for being Christian!
There's one that's racist, and there's the one that Patrick mentioned, which is bad because the characters are just too logical.
Here we are, a log cabin I rented so we could be intimate in safety, because it's not the 50s, so we don't have to park a car and neck at Inspiration Point.
That makes sense. I'm turned on by how logical you are.
You want to know something kind of awkward about this, though, that Patrick absolutely did not mention in his video? This is the second horror story to feature in the episode, and the only reason it gets told in the first place is in response to the first one. And the first deliberately bad horror story told is one that's bad because the entire story is driven by the characters making stupid, irrational decisions.
That sounds dangerous.
Fine, I'll get out and look.
Patrick, did you miss this one? The illogical character decisions here aren't presented as plot holes, they're presented more as, well...
I didn't care about the characters. They were stupid. They deliberately put themselves in danger, and when they were warned about it, the guy got out of the car. Your story's not scary because the characters are making choices the audience wouldn't make.
Patrick's video is entirely one-sided, presenting logic as something that's entirely irrelevant to storytelling. This Community episode, though, doesn't present this as a good story that doesn't worry about that kind of thing, and then a bad story that gets too bogged down in trying to be logical. It presents you with a first story where the problem is literally that it is too illogical. A character identifies that problem and then tries to fix the story, but doesn't do a good job because it's a comedy and watching them just tell a good horror story wouldn't be funny. This is a story that drastically overcompensates for the previously identified issue. All of the dialogue is just stilted explanations of the logic behind every single character decision.
I'm comforted by your shiny hair and facial symmetry. I just brushed my teeth, so this would be the optimal time to kiss.
Imagine watching this scene and genuinely thinking that the problem with it isn't the stilted dialogue, but the fact a guy chose to kiss a woman because he thought she was attractive at a time he could be sure he didn't have, like, bad breath or something.
And they're safety conscious in a way that would really only make sense if the characters knew they were in a horror story.
I brought it as a cautionary measure, because this cabin is within walking distance of the local insane asylum.
This story isn't just bad because the character made lots of logical decisions, Patrick. It is a poor horror story because the characters make good decisions in a way that just prevents them from falling into any danger. But you do realize that story 1 and story 2 aren't the only possible 2 stories. Right? Okay, I feel extremely patronizing even asking that, but this argument that Patrick makes over and over again depends on there being only 2 creative possibilities in the scenarios he's talking about. When he brings up the "why don't they just move to the waterfall" complaint about A Quiet Place,
why didn't they just move to the waterfall?
That section's conclusion is him saying that if characters didn't act in the way that he is advocating for, there wouldn't be any stories.
There would be no conflict, which would lead to no drama, which would lead to no story.
As if conflict couldn't possibly arise in a post-apocalypse dominated by monsters unless characters start making illogical decisions to further the plot. As if the only 2 creative possibilities within conceivable material reality are the story as it is, or a version of the story where they move to the waterfall and therefore avoid all conflict. Like, what if there just wasn't a waterfall in the story? If you remember, he also says the same thing about Die Hard.
If he did the perfect, most logical thing every single time, he wouldn't be the same character. He'd basically be a Vulcan, and the movie would end way earlier and be terrible.
No, Patrick! You totally could write a movie just like Die Hard, but about a character who makes consistently tactically sound decisions. It'd be different, but it wouldn't be some kind of impossible task. Does watching a character like Commander Data take on Hans Gruber sound like an unworkable concept to you? Because if it does, you're wrong, that would slap. What do you mean the movie would end way earlier? If by making the decisions that they would actually make, your character solves the conflict too easily, then puts them in a more challenging scenario. This isn't rocket science. Stop pretending that you don't know that's possible. He even makes the same point about Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Like, hey, if evil David Tennant had made any old object into a portkey and just handed it to Harry, he would have been sent to Voldemort right away and there wouldn't have been a story.
This, like so many plot holes, are things that would just destroy any conflict or drama and end the story immediately.
He says this despite the fact that apparently That same plot hole doesn't exist in the book, because in the book there are a few things that are a bit different. Almost as if that's a thing that's possible. Then he tries to make this same point again with The Last Jedi.
It would make logical sense for Admiral Holdo to tell Poe Dameron her plan. And then there would be no conflict and no drama. Poe would never send Finn on a mission, and Finn would never grow, and Poe would never grow, and there would be no story.
Why are you pretending that creative possibilities are so limited, Patrick? It's Star Wars. It is a galaxy at war. I'm sure there would still have been a conflict and a story if Admiral Holdo had made a few different decisions. As a writer, you control everything that happens in your story. There's very little that you're stuck with. This community episode is the perfect example to demonstrate the problems with Patrick's approach. Someone will complain about story 1 being too illogical.
Fine, I'll get out and look.
To which Patrick will say, that means you want story 2, as story 1 and story 2 are the only conceivable possibilities within reality. And since story 2 is bad, that means story 1 is the correct choice. This is a really good video that people still cite to me sometimes.
Patrick has spent a while now talking about why he thinks plot holes don't matter, but in a move that I genuinely think is pretty good, it's just a shame that all the arguments are bad, he's about to spend a brief moment talking about what he thinks actually does matter.
I am in no way telling you to turn your brain off or to not think critically about movies. Not at all. I'm saying you should worry about the things that actually matter. So, take Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice. I think it's a bad movie, and it has big old dumb logic issues, like why can Superman locate Lois Lane from her heartbeat but can't find his mother the same way? Why doesn't Wonder Woman, who isn't affected by kryptonite, be the one to use the spear against Doomsday? But those aren't the real problems with the movie. The actual problems are that many of the central characters are totally static and poorly motivated, and they don't learn anything or grow through the story, and the one major moment of growth is caused by a ridiculous plot contrivance.
Oh no. Not a plot contrivance. What Patrick is referencing here, of course, is that Batman comes down from wanting to kill Superman when he finds out that both their mothers share the same name, in a scene that humanizes Superman in Batman's eyes. And in 2016, humanized Hollywood script writers in my eyes. Of course, both these characters having mothers that share the same name is quite the coincidence, so it could be argued that this is quite a big plot contrivance, which, as Patrick has very clearly established, makes it a valid point of criticism. It would seem that this moment being driven by a contrivance makes it less impactful for Patrick, and you know what? Fair enough. But if you were to rewrite it so that in this version of the DC universe, Superman didn't even have a mother, let's say he was raised by a gay couple or something, suddenly this moment—
Why did you say that name?
It's his mother's name!
—would be complete and utter nonsense. A massive gaping plot hole. And therefore, according to Patrick, you can't cite it as a reason the movie is bad. We did it. We improved the script.
It's not just the plot being propelled by an unlikely event anymore, it's
a point in which a story breaks a previously established rule about its own universe. Basically, it's when a story contradicts itself.
Just to be clear, I'm not trying to tell you that Patrick would think this is actually an improvement. I'm trying to show you how poorly thought out this entire video was. And it's interesting to me that apparently a moment of character growth being driven by a plot contrivance can detract from that moment.
So much so that it's apparently valid to list it as one of only 3 reasons that an entire film is bad.
But a character death being driven by a plot hole is apparently fine. Batman v Superman ends with Superman using a kryptonite spear to kill Doomsday, which is this thing. Superman, who you probably know is vulnerable to kryptonite, seems to know from the off that by doing this he is sacrificing himself.
No, Clark, you can't.
This is my world.
No, Clark, don't.
And yeah, he fucking dies. The problem, though, if you subscribe to the criticism that Patrick is referencing, is that Wonder Woman is like right there this whole time and could do exactly the same thing, but she isn't vulnerable to kryptonite, so she would be fine. Meaning that this sacrifice is totally unnecessary and the emotions you're supposed to feel because of it are completely unearned. How is this not a valid criticism? He doesn't elaborate on that, he just says that this is a logic gap and not one of the film's quote-unquote real problems. But like, Why not, though? A hero taking the difficult but noble decision to sacrifice themselves because they have no other options left to save the day, emotionally, for most audiences, is gonna hit pretty different to a hero sacrifices himself because they haven't noticed that there's a pretty obvious solution that would make everything fine. It really do seem like you're just drawing arbitrary lines because you're mad a couple of your favorite movies of that year got hated on by a subset of audiences because they contained a lot of plot holes. Admittedly, though, that is just conjecture. But if it's anything else, I will lick the floor of a McDonald's bathroom. And that's it. We've reached the end of Patrick's arguments. There's no more left. Well, no, there is one more thing, but it's just an edit where he's put two clips next to each other to try and make a point. I'll play it now.
The plot holes. Remember the plot holes? So you're trying to tell me the supremacy, Snoke's ship, isn't powerful enough to penetrate the shields.
In episode 2F09, when Ichi plays Scratchy's skeleton like a xylophone, he strikes the same rib twice in succession, yet he produces two clearly different tones.
See? Look, this reviewer is exactly like this annoying dweeb from The Simpsons. If you ignore basically everything other than this is the kind of sentence a nerd would say. This dweeb in The Simpsons is being made fun of because he blows this small animation error way out of proportion.
I mean, what are we, to believe that this is some sort of magic xylophone or something? Boy, I really hope somebody got fired for that blunder.
Not only is he extremely condescending about it, he's also saying this to the cast of Itchy and Scratchy at a Q&A. It's very funny. The scene makes me laugh very hard. Angry Joseph here, though, spends a few minutes of his hour-long Last Jedi video going over a few of the plot holes he noticed. He's not obsessing over one little error. This is one sentence taken out of a list of reasons he and his friends weren't sold on the story of the film. In fact, it's not even one sentence. You conspicuously cut him off halfway through before he's finished talking. The chase scene they're talking about here is a core part of the film's story, and they found it hard to believe. Why are they not allowed to talk about that?
Why the f*** didn't you launch all fighters?
Yeah, because apparently the fighters can go straight through shields, as we saw.
Yep. Yeah, instead they launched 3 fighters.
I mean, the film seems to feel that it's worth its while to try and explain some of these things to the audience.
What is the point of all this if we can't blow up 3 tiny cruisers?
But caring about that explanation enough for it to be one of the things that you mention in an hour-long video reviewing the film? No, sorry, you are a loser and a dweeb. There is a little more of Patrick's video left. In it, he doesn't argue why plot holes don't matter though. Instead, he talks about the rise of plot hole discourse on the internet, complaining about the surface level criticisms delivered by things like listicle articles and CinemaSins. And I gotta say, yeah, those things suck. For those of you who don't know, I dedicated quite a long era of my channel to going over things like that and talking about how bad they are. The thing is though that these things generally come from content farms. The reason they're bad is that they're produced by people who are motivated by getting clicks rather than producing something of value. When someone is creating something like top 20 plot holes you missed in the Bible, Patrick is totally on the money with what the motivation normally is.
Their rise coincided with the arrival of listicle articles, and plot holes were the perfect clickbait.
CinemaSins, for example, clearly aim to have all of their videos reach a particular minimum length. Plus, they make 2 of those videos every single week. Forever. They do plenty of desperately clutching at straws and just lying on purpose so they can fill up their videos quickly enough to release them on time. This works for them because their core audience is made up mostly of the kind of people who would watch CinemaSins. They know they don't need to bother making airtight, valuable criticisms, so they don't. I think they and others like them are a genuine issue, and Patrick is right to be annoyed about them. He's just not very good at identifying what the actual problems with them are. Besides them though, we have plenty of other people who want to deliver valid criticism, but for whatever reason they're just not very good at it. There are plenty of people making very bad points about plot holes on the internet, misciting them or blowing them completely out of proportion. But when it comes to media critics who just don't seem to know what they're talking about, plot hole criticism isn't some hugely significant unifying factor between them. I think it's very important to understand that if these people take this video's advice and suddenly pivot towards talking about some other aspect of the films they watch, then there's no reason to assume that's going to improve their commentary. I mean, most of them do talk about other stuff. All the time. And they're not good at it.
Rick Sanchez is an excellent grandfather.
Obviously, plot holes aren't an inherently useless area of discussion. There are probably a few people out there who could do with focusing on them a bit less, but people who are bad at talking about them are pretty likely to be just as bad at talking about other things, unfortunately. I can't begin to express how far off the money anyone is who thinks the problem with CinemaSins is that they talk about plot holes too much.
Scene does not include lap dance.
I do think that there should be a space online, though, for discussing not only major plot holes, but also surface-level nitpicks. Sometimes it's fun to talk about the fact that a hat appears in Captain Picard's hand between shots. So long as it's not masquerading as something with more critical merit than it actually has, that's absolutely fine. Speaking of Star Trek, you're probably aware that online discussion of it is by no means limited to aspects of filmmaking that are traditionally considered to be academically valuable discussion topics. A Star Trek fan may well obsess over how, with all its androids and aliens, it's able to reflect the lived experiences of real people in interesting ways, but they're just as likely to obsess over all the different iterations of the Starfleet uniform and be able to explain to you the crucial role dilithium crystals play in sustaining a stable warp field. And you bet your ass, if a TNG-era Starfleet Chief Tactical Officer was shown wearing a blue uniform, these people would complain. That's the wrong color, and they'd still complain even if this wrong color somehow facilitated the story of the episode. These people place real value on how the Starfleet uniform is portrayed. Or, speaking more broadly, they care about a detail that other people consider to be insignificant. It's a way that a lot of people genuinely enjoy thinking about the stories they consume. Not every audience member is going to be someone who comes away from a work actively considering its artistic merit. While some people are going to get it actively wrong in ways that are actually bad, there's no reason to try and force everyone who enjoys discussing fiction onto the same page. Correcting people who are wrong can be fun, for an hour, but there are no incorrect topics to discuss. And on balance, whether it's Starfleet uniforms or plot holes, it's probably not the only topic they care about, even if it is something they can talk about for hours at a time. The perspectives of these people and what it is they personally value about the media they watch is something we can all learn from. Does every viewer have to personally care about the Starfleet uniform this much? Yes, it is obligatory. Even if it's not an aspect of the work that you're personally interested in discussing, the existence of people like this should highlight the value that it brings to the table. Having a fictional uniform with a thoroughly developed history and lots of different variations, all of which mean different things or belong to different eras, is something that helps to flesh out the world of Star Trek. They put care and attention into it for a reason, and it has plenty of benefits. It's been used to communicate aspects of the story numerous times in various creative ways. Look, I could spend a while talking about the benefits of attention being given to the Starfleet uniform, but let's just, move on. For you, it can be a small footnote in a story that you value for totally different reasons, but it is still not only a part of the work, but a part of the work that there is value in getting right. Even if you don't consciously appreciate it, it's still another aspect of the production contributing to the whole. You know, it's costume design. It's an important aspect of filmmaking. Plot construction is the same. It may or may not appeal to you as a topic of discussion, but it's still a part of the work. A story is like an enormous clock. It only works if all little cogs mesh together. A clock needs to be clean, full of lube, and wound tight. The best clocks have dual movements, cogs that fit, that cooperate by design. I'm being metaphorical, Patrick!